Who was the real monster lurking in the shadows of America's forgotten lands? And why do these ancient territories still harbor secrets that make seasoned FBI agents wake up screaming? We've all heard ghost stories, but few know the blood-soaked truths buried deep within reservation boundaries, where federal law bends and ancient spirits never sleep. Comment below where you're watching from and what time it is, because after tonight, you might never look at isolated communities the same way again. By the end of this video, you'll understand why some places on this earth are meant to remain undisturbed, and why the darkness that seeps from these sacred grounds has a hunger that spans generations. But this isn't even the strangest part. The call came through the FBI's Phoenix field office on a Tuesday morning in October 1987, when the desert air still carried the phantom scent of summer storms and the mountains wore crowns of early snow. Special Agent Maria Santos had been nursing her third cup of coffee, staring at paperwork that seemed to multiply like desert weeds, when Assistant Director Coleman's voice cut through the morning stillness like a blade through silk. "Santos, my office." Now, the tone carried weight. Not the everyday bureaucratic heaviness of federal procedure, but something deeper. Something that made her stomach clench with the familiar dread of cases that changed agents forever. As she walked down the sterile corridor, fluorescent lights humming their mechanical lullaby overhead, Maria couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking towards something that would rewrite everything she thought she knew about justice, about evil, and about the thin membrane that separates civilization from the howling darkness that lives in the spaces between. Coleman's office smelled of stale cigarettes and the particular brand of exhaustion that comes from decades of seeing humanity at its absolute worst. Behind his desk hung a map of Arizona, dotted with red pins marking unsolved cases, each one a story of violence, each one a family shattered, each one a reminder that monsters don't just exist in fairy tales. But today, Coleman's attention was focused on a manila folder so thick it seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. "Sit down, Santos," he said, not looking up from the file. "What do you know about the Gila River Indian Reservation?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre, and Maria felt her pulse quicken. She knew enough. A sprawling territory south of Phoenix, home to the Akaimil Oadam and Peepash peoples. A place where ancient traditions fought daily battles against modern corruption. "Some," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "Drug trafficking. Border issues. Why?" Coleman finally looked up, and Maria saw something in his eyes she'd never seen before. Not just fatigue, but genuine fear. Because in the last 6 months, 17 people have disappeared from that reservation. 17. Men, women, children, gone without a trace. And yesterday. He paused, his hand trembling slightly as he opened the folder. "Yesterday, we found 3 of them." The crime scene photographs that Coleman spread across his desk defied comprehension, defied the very notion that human beings were capable of such methodical, ritualistic horror. Maria had seen autopsy photos before, had witnessed the aftermath of gang violence and domestic disputes. But this was different. This was art painted in blood and bone, a masterpiece of suffering that spoke to something primal and utterly alien. The bodies had been arranged in a perfect triangle, their limbs positioned with mathematical precision, their faces. Maria's breath caught in her throat as she stared at the victims' faces because they were gone. Not cut away or removed, simply absent, as if they had been carefully extracted from reality itself, leaving behind smooth, featureless expanses of skin. The medical examiner says it's impossible. Coleman continued, his voice barely above a whisper. The bone structure is intact. The skull is perfect, but the faces, it's like they were never there to begin with. No surgical marks, no trauma, no explanation. He leaned back in his chair, suddenly looking every one of his 58 years. The tribal police found them arranged around an old medicine wheel, about 15 miles into the desert. And Santos? His eyes met hers across the carnage spread on his desk. There were witnesses. But this isn't even the strangest part. The witnesses, 3 children ranging in age from 7 to 12, had been found sitting in the center of the triangle, unharmed but catatonic, their eyes wide and unblinking as they stared at something that existed far beyond, on the visible spectrum of human understanding. For 3 days, they hadn't spoken, hadn't eaten, hadn't even acknowledged the presence of the social workers and psychiatrists who tried desperately to reach them through the wall of silence that surrounded them like a fortress built from traumatized neurons. It was only when Dr. Elena Yazzie, a Navajo psychiatrist who specialized in treating Native children, sat with them and began speaking in the old language. The language of their grandmothers, the language of stories told around fires that had burned for thousands of years. That the youngest child, a 7-year-old boy named Thomas, finally opened his mouth and released a sound that would haunt Maria's dreams for the rest of her life. It wasn't a scream exactly, though it contained elements of ultimate terror. It wasn't sobbing, though grief poured from it like blood from a severed artery. It was the sound of a child's mind breaking under the weight of witnessing something that should not exist, something that violated the fundamental laws of reality with such casual brutality that sanity itself became negotiable. He keeps saying the same thing, Dr. Yazzie had told Coleman over the phone, her usually steady voice fractured by exhaustion and something approaching despair. In O Autumn, over and over. They were hungry. They were so hungry. They ate the songs from our faces. The translation sent ice water through Maria's veins because she understood on some cellular level that bypassed rational thought entirely. That this wasn't metaphor or childhood fantasy. This was testimony from the front lines of a war between worlds, a conflict that had been raging in the shadows for generations while the rest of humanity slept peacefully in their beds. Convinced that the monsters were just stories, just echoes of ancestral fears that had no place in the modern world. But the reservation knew better. The reservation had always known better. For weeks before the disappearances began, residents had reported strange lights moving through the desert at night. Not the harsh white glare of helicopter searchlights or the steady yellow beams of car headlights, but something organic and shifting, like bioluminescent jellyfish swimming through an ocean of darkness. Livestock had been found mutilated in ways that defied both natural predation and human cruelty. Their bodies drained but unmarked, as if something had simply reached inside them and switched off the light of life without bothering to break the container. The tribal council had held emergency meetings, bringing together medicine men and law enforcement, traditional healers and modern investigators, trying to bridge the gap between 2 different ways of understanding reality. One that measured truth in forensic evidence and federal statutes. The other that recognized forces beyond the reach of laboratory analysis or legal precedent. But even the elders, men and women, whose wisdom stretched back through generations of accumulated knowledge, seemed baffled by what was happening on their land. "This is not our darkness," one elderly medicine woman had told the council, her weathered hands trembling as she spoke. This comes from somewhere else, somewhere that doesn't belong in our world. It wears our stories like stolen clothes, but underneath. She paused, her ancient eyes reflecting depths of knowledge that made Maria feel like a child playing with nuclear weapons. Underneath, it hungers for things that should never be food. And now, as Maria stared at the impossible crime scene photographs, at the mathematical precision of the arranged bodies, and the smooth, featureless voids where faces should have been, she began to understand that she wasn't just investigating a series of murders. She was standing at the edge of an abyss that had been carefully hidden behind decades of bureaucratic procedure and rational explanation. An abyss that was finally beginning to show its teeth. What happened next would challenge everything Maria thought she knew about the nature of evil. About the boundaries between the possible and impossible. About the price of curiosity when it leads you into territories that exist beyond the comforting borders of human understanding. Because the truth about what was happening on the Gila River Indian Reservation was worse than murder. Worse than madness. Worse than anything her FBI training had prepared her to comprehend. It was invasion. Not by foreign armies or terrorist cells, but by something that had been waiting patiently in the spaces between seconds, in the pause between heartbeats. For the precise moment when the barriers between worlds were thin enough to allow passage. And once that passage was opened, once the hungry things from elsewhere caught the scent of human consciousness, like sharks detecting blood in dark water, there would be no closing it again. The missing faces were just the beginning, just the appetizer before a feast that would consume not just bodies, but the very concept of identity itself. Leaving behind perfect human shells with nothing inside but an echoing void where souls used to live. 3 days after reviewing the impossible crime scene photos, Maria found herself driving through the stark beauty of the Sonoran Desert toward the Gila River Indian Reservation. Her government-issued sedan cutting through waves of heat that made the asphalt shimmer like water in a mirage. The landscape around her seemed to pulse with hidden life. Saguaro cacti standing like ancient sentinels, their arms raised in permanent supplication to a sky that burned blue-white with merciless intensity, while somewhere in the distance, mountains rose like the petrified spines of sleeping giants. But beneath the surface beauty, Maria could feel something else, something that made her skin crawl with the persistent sensation of being watched by eyes that existed just outside her peripheral vision. The radio crackled with static that almost sounded like whispered voices speaking in languages that predated human speech. And twice she had to resist the urge to pull over and search the seemingly empty desert for whatever was tracking her progress with predatory patience. The reservation's administrative offices sat at the intersection of 2 dirt roads, a cluster of prefabricated buildings that seemed to huddle together for protection against the vastness that surrounded them. Maria's first meeting was with Chief of Police Robert Antone, a man whose weathered face told stories of decades spent navigating the impossible balance between federal law and tribal sovereignty, between ancient wisdom and modern corruption. His handshake was firm, but Maria noticed the way his eyes kept darting toward the windows, as if he expected something to come crawling out of the desert at any moment. "Agent Santos," he said, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone who had learned not to trust easily. "I have to be honest with you. We've never seen anything like this. In 30 years of law enforcement, I've dealt with drug cartels, domestic violence, gang activity. But this He gestured toward an evidence board covered with crime scene photos and missing person reports. This is something else entirely. The evidence room felt like a shrine to inexplicable violence, every surface covered with artifacts that seemed to vibrate with malevolent energy. Photographs of the discovery site showed the 3 bodies arranged with geometric precision around an ancient medicine wheel that hadn't been used for ceremonies in over a century. Their faceless heads pointing toward the cardinal directions like compass needles drawn to some magnetic north that existed in dimensions beyond human perception. But it was the other evidence that made Maria's hands shake as she examined it. Personal effects from the missing that had been found scattered throughout the desert, but changed somehow, transformed into objects that retained their original shape while becoming something fundamentally other. A woman's wedding ring that felt ice cold to the touch, despite sitting in the Arizona heat for days. A child's toy truck that cast shadows in directions that defied the position of the sun. A man's wallet containing photographs of people no one could identify, even though the missing man's family swore they were pictures of themselves. Chief Antone led Maria to a small conference room where 3 members of the tribal council waited with the patient dignity of people who had witnessed the impossible and accepted it with the grace that comes from generations of surviving in a world that rarely makes sense. Elder Mary Blackwater spoke in a voice like wind through canyon stones, her words carrying the weight of accumulated wisdom. This began 6 months ago, when the archaeologists came. Maria's pen froze above her notepad. Archaeologists? Mary nodded slowly, her ancient eyes reflecting depths of knowledge that made Maria feel like a child stumbling through a darkness filled with patient predators. University people. They said they had permission from the state, that they were studying migration patterns of our ancestors. But they were digging in the wrong places, asking the wrong questions. She paused, her weathered hands folding with the deliberate care of someone choosing her words with surgical precision. Some places are not meant to be disturbed. Some stories are not meant to be told. They opened something that should have remained closed. But this isn't even the strangest part. The archaeological team from Arizona State University had arrived in April with all the proper permits and academic credentials, led by Dr. Jonathan Hartwell, a professor of Southwest archaeology whose published papers on indigenous burial practices had earned him recognition throughout the academic community. His team of graduate students and research assistants had set up their base camp near the old medicine wheel, using ground-penetrating radar and other modern technologies to map what they believed were previously undiscovered settlement patterns. For 3 weeks, they worked methodically, excavating test pits and cataloging pottery sherds with the meticulous care that characterized legitimate scientific research. But according to the tribal council, they were working in an area that had been specifically designated as off-limits by previous agreements, a section of the reservation that the elders considered too dangerous for casual exploration. We tried to warn them. Elder Blackwater continued, her voice carrying the weight of prophecy fulfilled too late. The young ones don't always listen to the old stories. But Dr. Hartwell, he was different. He listened, but he listened wrong. When we told him about the sleeping things beneath the earth, he heard it as metaphor. When we warned him about the price of waking what should sleep, he wrote it down in his notebook like folklore. Mariah could feel the temperature in the room dropping despite the desert heat pressing against the windows, as if the very act of recounting these events was summoning something from the spaces between words. On the night of the spring moon, they found the chamber. The phrase hung in the air like incense from a funeral, carrying implications that bypassed rational thought and struck directly at some ancestral terror that lived in the oldest parts of Maria's brain. The chamber had been discovered 15 feet below the surface, a perfectly circular room carved from living rock with a precision that defied explanation. The walls were covered in petroglyphs that seemed to move when viewed peripherally, symbols that hurt to look at directly but conveyed meaning on some subliminal level that made the observer's skin crawl with existential dread. In the center of the chamber sat a stone altar covered with designs that appeared to shift and change depending on the angle of observation, as if the ancient artists had somehow carved temporal paradoxes directly into the rock itself. But it was what lay beneath the altar that had driven Dr. Hartwell's team beyond the boundaries of academic objectivity and into territory that existed somewhere between archaeology and necromancy. They found bones, Chief Antone said, taking up the narrative with the reluctant duty of someone who had seen the aftermath of curiosity satisfied too thoroughly. But not human bones. Not animal bones either. Something else? Something that had been deliberately buried and sealed with prayers and warnings in languages that predate any written record we have. He pulled out a file containing photographs that made Maria's vision blur and her stomach clench with nausea that had nothing to do with physical discomfort and everything to do with exposure to visual information that human consciousness wasn't designed to process. The bones in the photographs were wrong. Not broken or deformed, but fundamentally incorrect, as if they belonged to creatures that had evolved in a universe with different physical laws, different mathematical principles governing the relationship between form and function. Dr. Hartwell's final field notes, recovered from the abandoned archaeological site, read like the journal of a man slowly losing his grip on sanity. Day 23. The bones are definitely not from any known species. Carbon dating suggests an age of approximately 12,000 years, but the structural composition defies classification. Dr. Peterson hypothesizes extraterrestrial origin, but I believe we're dealing with something far more terrestrial. Something that belongs to a period when the boundaries between species were more fluid. The students are showing signs of psychological stress. 3 have requested transfers back to Phoenix, citing health concerns. But I suspect they're simply unprepared for the magnitude of our discovery. We've uncovered evidence of a civilization that existed alongside early human settlements. A civilization that apparently worshipped entities that don't correspond to any known mythological systems. The petroglyphs in the lower chamber appear to be instructional, though for what purpose remains unclear. The final entry, dated the night before the team's disappearance, consisted of a single sentence repeated 17 times in handwriting that grew progressively more erratic with each repetition. They're waking up, they're waking up, they're waking up. By morning, the archaeological site was empty. Tents remained standing, equipment left running, meals half finished on paper plates, as if the entire team had simply vanished mid-sentence. The only signs of disturbance were the scattered bones from the underground chamber, arranged in patterns around the medicine wheel that seemed to pulse with bioluminescent energy when photographed with infrared equipment. And that was when the disappearances began. First, Dr. Hartwell's team, then local residents who lived closest to the excavation site. Vanishing one by one as something that had slept for millennia began to stretch ancient limbs and remember what it meant to be hungry. The first breakthrough came when Maria discovered that the disappearances weren't random. They followed a pattern that revealed itself only when she stopped thinking like a federal agent and started thinking like prey. Working through the night in Chief Antone's office, surrounded by maps and missing person reports, She had spread the evidence across every available surface like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle, designed by something that understood geometry in ways that violated Euclidean principles. Each disappearance occurred exactly 72 hours after the previous one, and each location formed points on an expanding spiral that circled the archaeological site with mathematical precision. But it was the personal details of the missing that revealed the true horror of the selection process. Every single victim had been born during lunar eclipses, their births occurring during moments when the boundary between worlds grew thin enough for things from elsewhere to notice the bright sparks of human consciousness being born into reality. It's hunting specific people, Maria explained to Dr. Elena Yazzie, the Navajo psychiatrist who had been working with the traumatized children. They sat in the medical clinic as dawn painted the desert in shades of blood and gold, surrounded by sleeping forms of the three witnesses who had been found at the center of the faceless triangle. Eclipse births. Every single one. That can't be coincidence. Dr. Yazzie nodded slowly, her eyes reflecting the deep knowledge that came from growing up immersed in cultures that had never forgotten the existence of things that lived in the spaces between heartbeats. In many traditions, children born during eclipses are considered different, more sensitive to the spirit world, more visible to things that hunt by spiritual emanation rather than physical presence. She gestured toward the sleeping children, their small forms curled beneath hospital blankets like quotation marks around some unspoken truth. These three were born during the same eclipse, 12 years ago. The entities, whatever they are, they left them alive for a reason. But this isn't even the strangest part. The children weren't just witnesses. They were living recording devices, their traumatized minds somehow retaining perfect sensory memories of events that should have been impossible to observe and survive. Under careful hypnosis conducted by Dr. Yazzie, young Thomas began to speak in voices that weren't his own, channeling conversations that had taken place between the entities responsible for the faceless murders. The words that emerged from his 7-year-old throat were spoken in languages that predated human speech. But somehow, Maria understood every syllable with a clarity that bypassed her conscious mind and etched itself directly into her soul like acid burning through metal. "The harvest grows thin," Thomas said in a voice like grinding stone, his small hands moving in gestures that hurt to watch directly. "The old agreements weaken. Soon we will need to renegotiate the terms of sustenance." The hypnosis sessions revealed details that transformed the case from inexplicable murders into something far more terrifying. Evidence of an ancient contract, a bargain struck between early human settlements and entities that existed in the margins of reality. Beings that fed on specific aspects of human consciousness in exchange for protection from other, even more malevolent forces that lurked in the darkness between stars. For thousands of years, this agreement had been maintained through careful ritual and sacrifice, a delicate balance that kept humanity safe by providing the entities with a steady supply of the spiritual energy they required for survival. But as traditional knowledge faded and modern skepticism replaced ancient wisdom, the rituals had been forgotten, the protective barriers weakened, and the entities had grown hungry enough to begin taking what they needed by force rather than contract. The archaeologists didn't just uncover bones. Dr. Yazzie explained as they reviewed the hypnosis transcripts, her voice heavy with the weight of understanding too much. They broke the containment that had been carefully maintained for millennia. The chamber wasn't a tomb. It was a prison. And when Dr. Hartwell's team disturbed the seals, They released something that had been waiting with the infinite patience of cosmic hunger for exactly this opportunity. Maria stared at the children's drawings created during art therapy sessions, images that seemed to writhe and shift when viewed peripherally, depicting creatures that existed in too many dimensions for human perception to fully process. In every drawing, the same symbols appeared, geometric patterns that seemed familiar despite being utterly alien, as if they tapped into some universal language of terror that transcended cultural boundaries. The missing persons reports took on new significance when Maria cross-referenced them with tribal birth records and astronomical data. Each victim had been born during one of 13 lunar eclipses that had occurred over the past 60 years, their births marking them with some invisible spiritual signature that made them detectable to entities that navigated reality using senses that operated beyond the electromagnetic spectrum. But the pattern revealed something even more disturbing. The entities weren't just randomly feeding. They were systematically harvesting specific individuals whose unique spiritual resonance could be combined to create something far more powerful than the sum of its parts. The faceless bodies found around the medicine wheel weren't just victims. They were components in some vast metaphysical mechanism, their stolen identities being processed and refined into a form of energy that could sustain beings whose very existence violated the fundamental laws of physics. Chief Antone had been conducting his own investigation, interviewing tribal elders and medicine people who possessed knowledge that existed beyond the reach of federal databases and academic research. What he discovered painted a picture of cosmic horror that stretched back to the very foundations of human civilization. "My grandmother used to tell stories," he said as he and Maria walked through the abandoned archaeological site, their footsteps echoing strangely in the desert silence. Stories about the first hunger, about things that came from the spaces between spaces when the world was young and the barriers between dimensions were still soft. She said our ancestors made a deal with them. Protection from the worst things that lurked in the dark, in exchange for feeding the first hunger in ways that wouldn't destroy our people entirely. He paused beside the excavated chamber, now cordoned off with crime scene tape that fluttered in wind that seemed to blow from directions that didn't exist on any compass. But the deal required constant maintenance, constant renewal. And when we forgot how to speak their language, when we stopped performing the old ceremonies, the contract became void. The implications were staggering. For thousands of years, human civilization had existed under the protection of entities that demanded payment in the form of specific types of spiritual energy. Energy that could be provided through willing sacrifice, through ritual transformation, through careful cultivation of individuals whose consciousness resonated at frequencies that the entities could consume without causing permanent damage to the donor. But as modern skepticism replaced traditional knowledge, as ancient ceremonies were dismissed as primitive superstition, the careful balance had been disrupted. The entities had waited as long as they could, subsisting on whatever spiritual energy they could gather from the weakening rituals. But eventually, hunger had overcome patience. They had begun taking what they needed by force, stripping the identities from eclipse-born individuals whose consciousness could be harvested and processed into the concentrated spiritual essence they required for survival. What happened next would determine not just the fate of the missing persons, but the future of human civilization itself. Because Maria was beginning to understand that the disappearances on the Gila River Indian Reservation were just the beginning of a feeding cycle that would continue until the entities had consumed enough spiritual energy to break free from the dimensional constraints that had contained them for millennia. Once that happened, once they achieved sufficient power to exist fully in human reality, the careful harvest of selected individuals would give way to wholesale consumption of human consciousness on a global scale. The faceless bodies were a warning, a demonstration of what awaited humanity if the ancient compact couldn't be renewed or the entities returned to their prison between worlds. And with each passing hour, as the spiral of disappearances continued its mathematical progression toward some inevitable conclusion, the window for preventing cosmic catastrophe grew smaller and smaller. The solution came from the most unlikely source. The 7-year-old boy named Thomas, whose traumatized mind had become a conduit between worlds, channeling information from entities that existed beyond the boundaries of human understanding. During his 4th hypnosis session with Dr. Yazzie, the boy began speaking in his own voice for the first time since the discovery. His words carrying a clarity that seemed impossible given his age and the magnitude of what he had witnessed. "They're not evil," he said, his small hands folded in his lap with the dignity of someone far older than his years. "They're just hungry, and they're scared." The statement sent shockwaves through everyone present because it reframed everything they thought they knew about the entities, transforming them from incomprehensible monsters into beings capable of fear, beings who might be reasoned with if approached correctly. "Scared of what?" Dr. Yazzie asked gently, her voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone walking through a minefield of psychological trauma. Thomas's eyes remained closed, but tears began streaming down his face as he accessed memories that existed beyond his conscious understanding. "The dark between," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the hum of the air conditioning. "There are things in the dark between that make them look like butterflies. Beautiful, harmless butterflies. They've been hiding here in the spaces where our world touches theirs. Because out there—" He paused, his entire body trembling with the effort of communicating concepts that had no equivalent in human language. "Out there, they get eaten by things that are hungry for hungrier things." The room fell silent except for the sound of Dr. Yazzie's pen scratching across paper as she recorded testimony that would never find its way into any official report. Maria felt pieces of the puzzle clicking together with the inevitability of a lock turning in its tumblers. The entities weren't invaders. They were refugees, beings that had fled from some cosmic catastrophe so terrible that even creatures capable of harvesting human consciousness preferred exile in the margins of reality to facing whatever waited for them in their original dimension. The ancient compact hadn't been a deal with demons. It had been a treaty with asylum seekers, beings that offered protection from worse things in exchange for the spiritual sustenance they needed to maintain their existence in a dimension that was fundamentally hostile to their survival. But as human civilization had evolved and forgotten the old ways, the treaty had lapsed, leaving the entities trapped between worlds, too weak to return home, too hungry to maintain their protective barriers against the approaching darkness. "What do they need?" Maria asked, leaning forward with the desperate intensity of someone grasping for any solution that didn't involve watching human civilization end in a feeding frenzy of cosmic proportions. Thomas opened his eyes for the first time in days, and Maria saw something in them that made her breath catch in her throat. Not the vacant stare of a traumatized child, but the ancient wisdom of something that had been observing human development for millennia. "They need the old words," he said in a voice that belonged neither to a 7-year-old boy nor to the entities that spoke through him, but to something else entirely. something that existed in the space between human and alien consciousness. They need someone to speak the old words in the old way, to renew the compact before the dark between notices that the barriers are failing. But this isn't even the strangest part. The old words existed, preserved in the deepest oral traditions of tribes across the Southwest. But they had been fragmented across generations, scattered among different communities like pieces of a key that could only unlock its intended door when reassembled correctly. Elder Blackwater knew portions of the ritual language, as did medicine people from the Tohono O'odham, the Hopi, and the Navajo nations. But none possessed the complete sequence. The ancient compact had been designed with this fragmentation as a safety feature, ensuring that the dangerous knowledge couldn't be accidentally activated by any single community, but requiring cooperation between multiple tribes to maintain the delicate balance between worlds. For 3 days, Maria found herself serving as a liaison between tribal leaders who hadn't spoken to each other in decades, using her federal authority to open doors that had been closed by generations of historical trauma and bureaucratic incompetence. The gathering took place at the medicine wheel, where the faceless bodies had been discovered. Representatives from 6 different tribes arriving with the solemnity of people who understood that they were participating in ceremonies that would determine the fate of 2 species. Maria watched as men and women who had spent lifetimes preserving fragments of nearly lost knowledge shared songs and words that seemed to make the air itself thicker, as if reality was responding to sounds that carried meanings beyond mere linguistics. The combined ritual lasted from sunset to dawn, voices rising and falling in harmonies that seemed to reach into dimensions that existed perpendicular to normal space-time, calling out to entities that had been waiting with diminishing hope for someone to remember the old agreements. As the ceremony reached its crescendo, the air above the medicine wheel began to shimmer like heat mirages, but cold instead of hot, as if reality was developing cataracts that blurred the boundaries between what was possible and what was necessary. Mariah felt the hair on her arms standing up as electromagnetic fields fluctuated around the gathered participants. And twice she was certain she saw figures moving in the distorted space above the ancient stones. Not the terrifying entities she had imagined, but beings that seemed almost fragile, their forms shifting between dimensions with the desperate grace of refugees seeking sanctuary. The missing faces began to reappear on the preserved bodies, identities returning to their rightful owners as the entities released what they had taken in exchange for the renewed promise of sustainable sustenance. Dr. Hartwell's archaeological team materialized at the edge of the circle as the final words of the compact were spoken. Their bodies intact, but their minds forever changed by months of existence in spaces between worlds. They remembered nothing of their captivity, but each carried with them a deep, instinctive understanding of the delicate balance that kept humanity safe from forces that existed beyond imagination. The missing reservation residents appeared throughout the following week, emerging from the desert with gaps in their memories, but alive. Their stolen spiritual energy returned in exchange for the promise that the old agreements would be maintained by future generations. The renewed compact established a new framework for coexistence, one that acknowledged both the entity's need for spiritual sustenance and humanity's need for protection from cosmic predators that lurked in the darkness between stars. Selected volunteers from each participating tribe would undergo training in the old languages and ceremonies, ensuring that the knowledge would never again be lost to time and skepticism. Maria found herself appointed as the federal liaison for this unprecedented arrangement, tasked with maintaining the careful balance between official ignorance and necessary truth, between the demands of bureaucratic procedure and the requirements of cosmic diplomacy. The case files were sealed and classified at levels that officially didn't exist. But the real story lived on in the oral traditions of the participating tribes, preserved in songs and ceremonies that would be passed down through generations of people who understood that sometimes the most important truths were too dangerous for written records. The archaeological site was declared off limits indefinitely. The chamber resealed with modern materials and ancient prayers, a double barrier designed to prevent future disturbances by well-meaning academics who lacked the wisdom to understand what should remain buried. 6 months after the renewal of the ancient compact, Maria stood once again at the edge of the medicine wheel as the sun set over the Sonoran desert. But this time she wasn't investigating impossible murders. She was participating in a quarterly ceremony designed to maintain the delicate balance between worlds. The ritual had become as much a part of her life as her federal duties, a reminder that some responsibilities transcended governmental authority and touched the very foundations of human survival. Around her, representatives from 6 tribes spoke words in languages that predated written history, their voices weaving harmonies that seemed to strengthen the barriers between dimensions while providing the entities with the spiritual sustenance they required for their continued protection of human civilization. The transformation in the reservation had been subtle but profound. Crime rates had dropped to levels not seen in decades, not through increased law enforcement, but through some indefinable change in the spiritual atmosphere that made violence feel foreign and unnecessary. Children who had been born during recent eclipses showed signs of enhanced intuition and emotional sensitivity, but they were no longer isolated by their gifts. Instead, they were carefully trained by tribal elders who understood the importance of nurturing individuals who could serve as early warning systems for dimensional instabilities. The archaeological site remained sealed, but new protocols had been established for any future excavations in areas where ancient compacts might be disturbed, protocols that required consultation with tribal authorities and spiritual leaders before any permits could be issued. But this isn't even the strangest part. The renewal of the compact had attracted the attention of other entities, beings that had been waiting at the edges of reality for signs that humanity was ready to acknowledge the broader cosmic community that existed beyond the narrow spectrum of electromagnetic radiation that defined human perception. Maria found herself dealing with contact scenarios that made alien abduction reports seem quaint by comparison. Negotiations with crystalline intelligences that communicated through controlled gravity fluctuations. Diplomatic exchanges with hive minds that existed as symbiotic relationships between multiple species. Trade agreements with beings that offered advanced medical knowledge in exchange for access to human artistic expression, which they consumed like a narcotic. The federal government's response to these developments had been predictably bureaucratic. A new department created within the FBI, officially tasked with investigating unusual atmospheric phenomena, but actually serving as humanity's first diplomatic corps for interspecies relations. Maria found herself promoted to director of this shadow organization, managing a staff of agents who had been carefully selected for their ability to function in realities that violated every principle of normal law enforcement. They worked in offices that didn't officially exist, investigating cases that would never appear in public records, maintaining the illusion of a world where the only intelligences were human, while quietly managing relationships with dozens of species that had been observing human development with varying degrees of interest and concern. The children who had witnessed the faceless murders grew up to become bridges between worlds, Their traumatic experiences transformed into specialized knowledge that made them invaluable as translators and cultural liaisons for entities that existed beyond normal human perception. Thomas, now 13 and possessed of wisdom that seemed to span centuries, served as Maria's primary consultant on cases involving temporal anomalies and dimensional instabilities. His ability to communicate with beings that existed outside linear time made him an essential resource for preventing paradoxes and maintaining the delicate balance that kept reality functioning according to recognizable physical laws. Dr. Elena Yazzie had established a new therapeutic practice that specialized in treating individuals who had experienced contact with non-human intelligences, developing techniques that integrated traditional healing methods with cutting-edge understanding of consciousness and quantum mechanics. Her waiting room was filled with clients who couldn't discuss their experiences with conventional therapists. Abductees, contactees, individuals who had accidentally stumbled through dimensional weak points and returned with memories that conventional psychology couldn't process. She worked closely with Maria's department, providing psychological support for agents whose jobs required them to interact regularly with beings that could drive lesser minds to madness through casual conversation. Chief Antone had been appointed as the tribal liaison for the Federal Contact Program, a position that required him to balance the interests of his people with the broader needs of human civilization. He traveled frequently between reservations, consulting with tribal leaders about cases involving supernatural phenomena and ensuring that ancient wisdom was properly integrated with modern investigative techniques. His office had become a clearinghouse for information about unusual events across Indian country, a network that provided early warning for dimensional instabilities and cosmic threats that might otherwise escape federal attention until they had grown beyond containment. The annual report that Maria submitted to officials whose security clearance exceeded the classification levels of nuclear secrets painted a picture of a world balanced on the edge of transformation, where humanity's recognition of its place in a broader cosmic community had opened doors to both unprecedented opportunities and existential risks that defied comprehension. Trade agreements with crystalline entities had provided access to healing technologies that eliminated most forms of cancer, while diplomatic relationships with time-sensitive beings had yielded warning systems for natural disasters that saved thousands of lives annually. But each new relationship brought new responsibilities, new protocols for maintaining balances that could affect the stability of reality itself. The most significant challenge had come from entities that fed on negative emotional energy, beings that had been deliberately cultivating human conflict for millennia as a form of agriculture. The ancient compact had provided protection from their influence, but the renewal process had required renegotiating terms that acknowledged humanity's evolution while maintaining safeguards against manipulation. The solution had involved establishing emotional wildlife preserves, designated areas where these entities could harvest the naturally occurring negative energy produced by human civilization without actively encouraging warfare, genocide, or other large-scale sources of suffering. It was an imperfect compromise, but one that prevented the need for more drastic interventions that might have required revealing the existence of the broader cosmic community to a human population that wasn't ready for such knowledge. Late at night, when her official duties were complete and the weight of managing humanity's cosmic relationships temporarily set aside, Maria often returned to the medicine wheel where her understanding of reality had been fundamentally restructured. Standing in the circle of ancient stones, surrounded by desert silence broken only by the whisper of wind through saguaro spines, she reflected on how much had changed since that first phone call from Assistant Director Coleman. The world still looked the same to most human observers, The same sun rose over the same horizon. The same stars followed their predictable courses across familiar skies. But beneath the surface of apparent normalcy, reality hummed with the constant activity of beings that existed beyond imagination. Entities that had always been there, but were only now beginning to emerge from shadows that had hidden them for millennia. The children born during eclipses continued to disappear occasionally. But now their absences were temporary educational exchanges rather than permanent abductions. Their consciousness expanded through exposure to forms of knowledge that would help humanity navigate its emerging role in galactic civilization. They returned with understanding that couldn't be communicated through normal language, carrying wisdom that would prepare future generations for revelations that would transform human civilization beyond recognition. Mariah had learned to read the signs that indicated when such exchanges were about to occur. And she worked with tribal authorities to ensure that families were prepared for separations that would ultimately benefit not just their children, but the entire species. If you've made it this far into this forbidden journey, you're part of a circle that extends beyond the boundaries of any single world. A community of seekers who understand that the most important truths are often hidden in the spaces between official records and acknowledged reality. The stories from the Gila River Indian Reservation continue to unfold. New chapters written each time the barriers between worlds grow thin enough for careful observers to glimpse the vast tapestry of existence that surrounds our small corner of space-time. Do you think you could maintain the balance between worlds if you discovered that everything you thought you knew about reality was just the surface of something infinitely deeper and more dangerous? Could you carry the weight of knowledge that could drive others to madness? Or would you choose the comfortable ignorance that keeps most of humanity sleeping peacefully in beds surrounded by cosmic forces that could erase our species with casual indifference? If these forbidden tales have awakened something in your spirit, if you feel the call to explore the margins where official truth meets impossible reality, then join our circle of seekers. Subscribe to walk beside me as we venture deeper into territories that exist beyond the reach of conventional understanding, where every shadow might hide truths that could reshape human civilization forever.